Well, I just want to do a follow-up video on my equivalent to a T-match tuner experiment that's using only variable inductors instead of a switchable inductor and two variable capacitors. In my last video, although I demonstrated what it could do to some extent, I didn't actually demonstrate me doing anything because it was difficult for me to show everything at the same time. So basically, I'm going to explain this based on, first of all, the classic T-match antenna tuning unit. So we normally have our active and ground reference input, and the active, first of all, has a variable capacitor. It carries right through also to another variable capacitor on the output, ground rail carrying right through. Halfway between the two, we have a variable inductor jumping across. And in a classic, let's just have a look, like a classic ATU like this, as you're switching the band selector, you're just switching how many turns on the variable inductor. Now, I've been practicing and experimenting for a long time with variable inductors in the sense of using permanent magnets or electromagnets to literally vary the inductance in a very gradual way, like we do with a variable capacitor. Unlike what we do with like a switchable inductor, because it's very, very sudden. Jump, jump, jump as we jump through things, but that's okay because we trim with the variable capacitors. So now capacitors, of course, are the inverse of induction in a sense. So if this is positive, this is negative. And I wanted to literally use variable inductors, but be able to change the sign so that I could actually make a variable inductor behave as if they are variable capacitors. So keeping that in mind, so we'll look at the capacitor on the input, the capacitor on the output, and the inductor that's jumping across. Now, I don't know all the fancy terms. I'm just a beginner, but I'm an obsessive experimenter. So here is my equivalent to a T-match, and what we have here is the active input going into what would be the first variable capacitor, but in this case it's not, it's a variable inductor. It then carries out and goes to this unit, which is where the switching of signs is occurring. Now, also it carries across to this variable inductor, which would be the second variable capacitor, at the same time as jumping across through this variable inductor back to ground, which would be this variable inductor back to ground. So 1 and 2 is 1 and 2, and 3 here is this one here. Now, you may notice I've got permanent magnets positioned inside these cores, so their magnetic torus fields would be coming out and around, out the front and around in the back. So the magnetic lines would be 90 degrees to anything rotating, which would be the normal magnetic field, which would be created by a winding with a current around that core. It would create magnetic lines in that way. So the magnetic vectors are 90 degrees offset, so virtually ineffectual to these cores. But just outside of these, I have extremely powerful permanent magnets. Now, as I rotate these, they steer the torus of these. and it starts to then change the behavior within the core. Now, these inductors, my own design, inspired by Nikola Tesla, though my own variation, are quite high amount of microhenries, and they're also very high Q. So what I'll do now is I'll just do a little demo. So I'm at 80 meters, 3.691 AM mode. I'll just put the microphone between my legs so that I can transmit, and I'll try and get all this showing at once. So I'm transmitting, and you can see the SWR is low. I'll just come in and show that. I've got it showing SWR when I transmit. Now, so back to what I was talking about before, the what I called number 3, like the variable inductor across the ground. In that this particular scenario, that's this one. So I'm going to adjust the inductance across the ground. There we go. Now, as for this one is the equivalent to the variable capacitor on the input side. And as for this one, this is equivalent to the variable capacitor on the output side. Which, oh, there we go, we are getting some changes. Yep. This is very tricky because none of this is fixed in place, it's all loose. So I'll vary the equivalent to the switchable inductor across the ground. There you go, so you get the idea. And so this is, pardon me, very diverse. VK3 Fox Victor Kilo India, testing on the frequent cycle. So that's a diverse tuner, like a T-match. It can match a high impedance or a low impedance, as this can do. And except there's no variable capacitor, no need for a traditional large inductor. But of course, we do then go into the limitations of the cores. So I would say this, with a bit of tweaking, might go up as far as 10 meters. But ideally, this is more optimal for, let's say, this particular one, maybe for 600 meters through to 20 meters. Yeah, so, but it's a proof of concept really, and I'm no expert, I'm just an experimenter, but I do think that this concept could be taken further, even into other bands. Now, having it set up with motors that can have these nice and firm and rotate them perfectly, because as it rotates, it steers the torus field of the internalized magnets. Now, I don't have to have these here, and this will still do a similar thing, but this actually adds to my effect. I have done, before I perfected this sort of diversity, I did use magnetic tuning a lot with electromagnets, steering permanent magnets, etc. But I finally nailed it with creating an equivalent to a T-match. And today I've also achieved another one, extremely simple, in a very small box with just 2 cores. It's also very diverse, but I won't go into that now because I've got to do more experiments with it. 7-3, and thanks for watching. VK3 Fox Victor Kilo India.